The Reverend Dr. Reid Trulson is the retired Executive Director and CEO of International Ministries, also known as the American Baptist Foreign Mission Society. He has previously served as the American Baptist Representative to Europe in Austria and the Czech Republic, the Area Director for Europe and the Middle East, the Scripture Union Regional Traveling Secretary in Ghana, and as a Baptist pastor in California and Wisconsin. Reverend Dr. Trulson is the author of introductions to Lee B. Spitzer's Baptist Jews and the Holocaust, The Sincere Hand of Friendship, and Daniel L. Buttrey's Blessed Are the Peacemakers. And he's also contributed many articles to the American Baptist Quarterly. His work on Charlotte Attlee White Robe, a story of America's first appointed woman missionary, was published by Mercer University Press in 2021. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome you, Reid, to this evening's Friends of the Angus Seminar, Female Missionary, a Challenge for Two Nations.
Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you for the invitation to be able to speak about Charlotte Attlee White Robe. And I'm going to be very interested in your reflections, your comments, and your questions at the end of our time together. I will say that I had been, along with most Baptists in America, in the custom of referring to Adoniram and Ann Judson as our first Baptist missionaries from America. It was in 2013 when we were preparing for the 200th anniversary of the American Baptist Foreign Mission Society that I delved more deeply into some of our own archives and discovered, to my amazement, that Ann Judson had never been appointed. And as I looked further, I discovered that no women were being appointed at that time. Our mission society formed in 1814, and the very first action that they took was to appoint Adoniram, but not his wife, for ministry that they were already doing in Burma. I then discovered that the very next year, there was the name of a woman, Mrs. Charlotte H. White, who had been appointed as a missionary to serve with the Judsons in Burma. And I was puzzled by this because I'd never run across her name in all of the research I'd done about the Burma mission. As I did more research, I discovered that she was the first woman who had been appointed as a missionary by any denomination or mission sending agency in all of America, which lended greater impetus to wonder who she was. Why had I never heard of her? One of the things that really began to break open the understanding of this remarkable woman was when I discovered that the Angus Library and Archives holds the records of the BMS, and among those, a large quantity of personal correspondence that both Joshua Rowe and Charlotte Rowe maintained with the BMS. And so I was able to spend 3 delightful days at the Angus, spending most of that time with the permission of the staff, using my cell phone to take pictures of all these pages of letters, and then going back home to the States to transcribe all of that handwritten material and begin studying. That led me to additional resources in the UK, in India, and in the United States. And the result was the ability to reclaim the knowledge of the life and ministry of this wonderful woman. Let me just start to share my screen, if I may, and tell you a bit about Charlotte, who she was, her life, and then we'll entertain questions and interactions later on. Charlotte Hazen Attlee was born in 1782, right at the end of the war, the American War of Independence. She was the 11th and last child of William and Augustus Attlee and his wife Esther. As you can see by this picture of their home in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, the Attlees were upper middle class. In fact, William Attlee was a prominent lawyer and would become a judge, a prominent judge in Pennsylvania. The family were members of the Anglican Church, St. James Anglican Church, which was located directly across the street from their home. We do not have details about the kind of education that Charlotte had in early childhood. It is possible that this prayer book may have been one of the things to which she was exposed. It was written by the pastor of St. James, the Reverend William Barton, who was a missionary of the Society of the Propagation of the Gospel, so one of a number of Anglican missionaries working in the United States. This particular book was based on the Book of Common Prayer, but geared for families and children. It was printed in the nearby community of Ephrata at the cloister that was run by the Baptist monks in Ephrata. So although, as I say, we don't have details of Charlotte's early education, later experiences in her life suggest that she did receive a very significant education. But Charlotte also experienced a number of traumatic experiences. When she was 8 years old, her mother died. 3 years later, her father died. That meant that her life in Lancaster was shattered. The family, she and her remaining siblings, were scattered to live with various other members of the family. And Charlotte was sent to Rutland, Massachusetts, to live in the home of her oldest sister, Elizabeth Amelia, who had married and had a family there in Rutland. So Charlotte spent her adolescent years and her early adulthood in the center of Massachusetts. There, she met the half-brother of her sister's husband, a gentleman named Nathaniel Hazen White. She and Nathaniel married in the Congregational Church in Rutland, and a little over a year later, she gave birth to their son, a little boy whom they named after her father, or after his father. So he was also Nathaniel Hazen White. But several months after the birth of this baby boy, Charlotte's husband, Nathaniel, died. And then about 4 months after that, their baby boy died. Once again, Charlotte was plunged into dual traumas. And it was during that time that Charlotte moved from Rutland about 60 miles further east to the community of Haverhill, Massachusetts. She moved there and moved into the home of some of her husband's relatives. There in Haverhill, Massachusetts, she met the Baptists. Now, you recall, she grew up Anglican. She was married Congregationalist. Now she encounters Baptists. And under the ministry of the Reverend William Batchelder, pastor of the Baptist Church, Charlotte experienced a spiritual renewal, which she referred to as her conversion. She was therefore baptized here in the Merrimack River on the edge of the community. We know a little bit about her baptism. Now, I have to ask you, have you ever noticed that sometimes a man and a woman can do the very same thing, but the actions of the woman are interpreted rather differently than those of the man? Well, that's what happened on this occasion. Charlotte was baptized. One of the people who had gathered on the banks of the Merrimack to witness the baptism was a Congregationalist lawyer named Leverett Saltonstall. Lawyer Saltonstall knew something about the Baptists. He would on occasion attend a worship service in the Baptist church. He said in his journal that the Baptists practice baptism by plunging. So he was interested in watching the plunging on the day that Charlotte White was to be baptized. He wrote that as Charlotte prepared for her baptism by wading into the river, she did something that surprised him. Namely, she began to sing, as lawyer Saltonstall wrote in his journal, she struck up a tune, which he felt was quite unnecessary and seemed a bit like ostentation. He said that he thought she had a rather romantic personality, and it must have now been turned toward religion. In other words, instead of seeing her spontaneous singing as an expression of her spirituality, he saw it as a quirk of her personality. Nevertheless, Charlotte was baptized. She became a member of the Baptist Church in Haverhill. That congregation was strongly involved in mission. It had been receiving information about the work of the British Baptist missionaries, William Carey, Joshua Marshman, William Ward, and others in Serampore. It had received a letter from the Baptist missionary William Johns, who had stopped in the United States on his way to India. The Reverend Johns had asked if the Haverhill Church would be willing to contribute toward the translating of scriptures at Serampore. And so Reverend Batchelder and leaders of the congregation did that very thing, began collecting funds to send to Serampore. The congregation also had created a mission society, the Auxiliary Mission Society for India and foreign areas. So they were quite engaged, and Charlotte tells us that when she experienced her conversion, when she became part of the Baptist Church in Haverhill, it was then that she discerned that God was calling her to mission service. Because of that, Charlotte moved from Haverhill to Philadelphia. Now, Philadelphia was a significant site for Baptists and mission because it was here in Philadelphia in 1814 that Baptists from New York and New England all the way south to Georgia had gathered, and in 1814 formed an organization that they called the General Missionary Convention of the Baptist Denomination of the United States of America for Foreign Mission. Very catchy title. They immediately formed a board of managers called the Baptist Board of Foreign Missions. That Baptist board would meet monthly to do the ongoing work of the mission. And so Charlotte moved into the center of this organized work of mission. She immediately joined the Sansom Street Baptist Church in Philadelphia. You can notice by this picture that the architecture of the church was significant. It was really a circular church. The interior had a circular baptistry in the very center of the building. So the building itself drew attention, but even more so, the pastor, the Reverend William Stoughton, drew attention of people in Philadelphia. William Stoughton was from England. In October of 1792, when 11 Baptist pastors gathered in Kettering and formed the Baptist Missionary Society, it was William Stoughton, who was the young seminarian, who was also present and participated in that meeting. At the end of the meeting, they took a collection. He didn't have any money, so he had to borrow some money from one of the pastors to make his contribution. He later said it was one of the most important actions he thought he had ever taken in his life. William Stoughton was involved with other members of that group in determining that William Carey and John Thomas would be the first British Baptist missionaries to be sent to India. William Stoughton was on the wharf on the day that the Careys and the Thomases set sail for India. He subsequently immigrated to the United States. He married Maria Hanson, who also immigrated. Both William and Maria Stoughton were very staunch advocates for mission, and William had been trying to encourage Americans to form a society similar to the Baptist Missionary Society in England. At this time, Charlotte White having come to know a great deal about mission in Haverhill and now learning a great deal more at the Sansom Street Baptist Church in Philadelphia, Charlotte began to become an activist. 5 months after the National Baptist Society was organized in Philadelphia, Charlotte, along with her pastor's wife, Maria Stoughton, and other women in the Sansom Street Church, formed the Sansom Street Female Baptist Missionary Society. And it was to give education on mission, to support the work of Carey, Marshman, and Ward, and others in India, and also to encourage others to become missionaries. A year later, Charlotte herself applied for appointment and was appointed as a missionary in June of 1815. She had then become the first woman in America to officially be appointed as a missionary. Now, this gentleman, the Reverend Henry Holcomb, was a member of the Baptist Board. He was the pastor of the First Baptist Church of Philadelphia, whereas other actions of the board had all been unanimous, and they had been taken by a quorum of 7 men. You see, the members of the board, there were 21 men who were part of the board, but they lived in states from New York all the way down to Georgia. And there was no way that those members of the board could all come to Philadelphia every month for meetings. So they had empowered a quorum of 7 people to act on behalf of the full board. So Reverend Holcomb was one of the 7. He did not vote in favor of Charlotte's appointment. Indeed, he said that he felt it was absolutely wrong to have appointed her. Earlier in his life, he had given evidence of his belief that has been summarized as the separate spheres ideology. It was an ideology that was very much present both in Britain and the United States, that the Creator God had created humankind, but had intended men and women for different spheres of life, a public sphere and a domestic sphere. The man was intended for the public sphere, to be engaged in politics and religious leadership and business, anything that faced outward to the public. Whereas it was God's design that the woman's sphere was domestic. It was to be the role of a wife, a mother, a nurturer of children. Reverend Holcomb gave language to this in a circular letter he had written concerning the duties and privileges of female members of the church. In that circular letter, he spoke of the inferiority in some respects of the woman to the man. He asserted that it is man who is the image and glory of God, and that it was improper for a woman to be in any role that usurped the authority of men. What did this then mean for Charlotte White, who had been appointed by the board? Quite apparently, Reverend Holcomb insisted that even though a majority of the quorum had appointed her, if the entire board had been present, surely she would not have been appointed. So the rest of the quorum of the board agreed to poll all 21 members. So a letter was sent out to all members of the board asking the question, did it conform to the board's constitution? Was it legal for Mrs. Charlotte White to be appointed as a missionary? Now, members of the board faced a bit of a problem. They had written their constitution, their bylaws, using the word missionary, but they had not defined the word. We know that the word missionary was coined in the 1500s by the Jesuits, so it was a word in use, but nowhere in the Baptist mission constitution was the word defined to specify that missionaries must be men, nor was it defined that missionaries must be ordained. So one by one, the responses from the other board members reached Philadelphia saying, yes, it was legal for Charlotte to be appointed. However, some of those responses also raised the question, while it's okay that we appointed her, it was legal that we appointed her, do we really have sufficient funds to send her? It so happens that Charlotte at this time had a modest estate. Part of that came from her deceased parents. Part of that came from her deceased husband. Charlotte went to the leadership of the board to give much of her estate as a gift to the board on the condition that they would use those funds to cover her expenses. The board received the gift of money. It meant, however, that the first woman in America to be officially appointed as a missionary would fund her own ministry. And she would continue to do that throughout the entirety of her service in India. Now, just about a year ago, I was able, with the help of some friends, to locate the journal that Charlotte wrote, which she began on the day that she boarded the sailing ship, preparing to sail to India, and she continued to write up through 1822, a period of 7 years. The journal begins with indication that Charlotte intended that at least some of the journal be made public. We know that because she used a pen name at the beginning. She chose the pen name Onesta. You'll also notice that she said that this was going to be a journal and copies of some letters that related to her missionary career. Now, those two words may not strike us as being very revolutionary, but in 1815, they were extremely revolutionary and a challenge to the views of many people. We've already discovered that Reverend Holcomb and a number of others had insisted no woman could be a missionary. She could be a missionary's helper. She could be a missionary's spouse, but not a missionary herself. Charlotte claimed the word, claimed the title, and she also says, I'm talking about my missionary career. This is at a time when most people would say the only career for a woman is to be a mother, a wife, and one who cares for nurturing children. Already in her journal, in her private thoughts, Charlotte is embracing an identity which in the minds of many people is rather revolutionary. Now, 1815 was an important time for Charlotte to have been appointed. I've already said that Adoniram Judson and his wife Anne had already been working in Burma. They had gone there at the urging of William Carey. They were not being allowed by the East India Company to stay in India, and Carey had suggested that they move to Rangoon and join his son Felix, who had begun mission work there. So they moved to Rangoon, and almost immediately Felix Carey and his family left, leaving the Judsons there alone in Rangoon. The Judsons had immediately thrown themselves into language acquisition and the work of translating the scriptures into Burmese and writing religious tracts. Now they were sufficiently at the place where they needed someone to be a printer in order that their translated work could be put in printed form and distributed. So they asked the board in the United States to appoint a printer. The board found a gentleman, the Reverend George Howe, who had been a printer before he was ordained as a Baptist pastor. He volunteered to go, so he was appointed for the work in Burma. He and his wife Phoebe came to Philadelphia. The Howes and Charlotte Rowe sailed and arrived 5 months later here in Calcutta. They were met by several of the missionaries that had come down from Serampore, and then they immediately went several miles north on the Hooghly River to Serampore, where they met face-to-face with William Carey, with Marshman, with William Ward, and several others. Charlotte immediately began to study. She studied Burmese as she was preparing to go on to Rangoon. She studied religious customs, so she made a number of trips to the temple of the Hindu god Juggernaut and observed the annual procession of the god. But the particular reason that the Americans had stopped in India rather than going directly to Burma was that William Carey was going to donate one of the presses at Calcutta to the work in Burma. Now, it took 2 months for the Americans to find any ship that could carry them and the printing press and the type from Calcutta to Rangoon. During that time, Charlotte met the British Baptist missionary Joshua Rowe, who was working there in Calcutta as part of the growing mission staff. Joshua had 3 sons. His wife had died a couple years earlier, leaving him the widowed father with 3 small boys. Several weeks after Joshua and Charlotte met, Charlotte received a letter from Joshua proposing marriage. Charlotte was not expecting this. She sought out William Carey to ask him about the character of this gentleman, Reverend Rowe, and to get Reverend Carey's assessment. And both of them essentially felt that this must be the providence of God. For one thing, Carey said, if you go on to Burma, you will find that you will have very little ability to engage in the kind of ministry that you want to do because of the social attitudes related to women. Whereas if you are here and you are married to Reverend Rowe, you could begin your ministry almost immediately. In any case, he said, don't keep Reverend Rowe waiting. And Rowe knew he had needed to write that letter because no one knew when a ship would be found, and Charlotte and the Howes would be setting off for Rangoon. So Charlotte said yes, and plans were made for their wedding. The wedding took place at St. John's Anglican Cathedral in Calcutta. The wedding took place there because the 1753 Marriage Act, known as Lord Hardwicke's Act, that had been passed by Parliament in Britain, had stipulated that the only marriages that had legal standing were those that would be performed by Anglican clergy. So Charlotte and Joshua, along with other Baptist missionaries in India, would have their weddings solemnized by Anglican clergy. Shortly after their wedding, Charlotte and Joshua's 3 sons got aboard a boat and began the slow process up the Hooghly, all the way some 400 miles to a community called Digha, located on the very banks of the Ganges. Digha was located 9 miles west of the ancient city of Patna. Patna is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. This painting of the main street of Patna was done by an Indian artist named Sita Ram, who painted this scene in 1815. That is to say, it's contemporary with Charlotte and her arrival in Digha. This would be the kind of thing that Charlotte and Joshua would have seen in Patna. Patna had become a hugely important commercial center for the East India Company. It was also an important governmental and administrative center. So there was a large number of British citizens in and around Patna related to the work of the East India Company. So Patna is 9 miles to the east. 1 mile to the west of Digha is the community of Dinapur, in which there was a large military cantonment. Soldiers from the Crown or from the East India Company would be stationed here at the cantonment. Usually they were not allowed to stay there more than 2 years, and then they were moved on and reassigned to some other area. The property that the Baptists had purchased for the mission station was 1 mile away from the cantonment. we have this hand-drawn map of the Baptist mission in Diga that Charlotte drew and sent to the BMS in 1824. This map is in the collection at the Angus Library and Archives. You'll see that the Baptists had been able to purchase several bungalows to create a mission station. You'll also notice that the Ganges was encroaching on the bank every year when the rainy season would come and the Ganges would flood. It continued to eat away at the bank. So by the time Charlotte arrived, at least one of the bungalows had already toppled into the river and had been washed away. Bungalows were something of this kind of style. They were a kind of structure that was based on a traditional Bengali dwelling. The East India Company adopted this style and used it to house its soldiers as they were stationed in different parts of British India. Typically, these bungalows were square or rectangular, were surrounded by wide verandas, had, as in the case shown here, the four corners were bathrooms. Diagonally adjacent to those were sleeping rooms. And then the four other sections on each side could either be left open or often were enclosed as side rooms, leaving a larger center room. This was the kind of structure of the bungalows at Diga. It was in the center room of this bungalow that Charlotte and Joshua operated an English language boarding school. Now, why would they have an English language boarding school? It's because Joshua Rowe and his colleague William Moore and most of the other Baptist missionaries who were being appointed were not given a salary by the BMS. They were instead encouraged to be entrepreneurial, to find ways to raise funds in the country, with the BMS then providing what we would call ministry funds. So you raise funds for your own personal needs. The society provides additional funds for ministry. So this was the kind of situation at Diga. The children that were being taught in the boarding school were the English-speaking Eurasian children of British soldiers and Indian or Eurasian wives. The work that Charlotte did was multilingual. She was one of the teachers in the English language school, but she also quickly became a teacher in Hindi language schools. Charlotte devoted herself to acquiring Hindi and was a remarkable linguist, because we know that she was already able to read and teach in Hindi a year after her arrival at Diga. This was a stark difference between herself and her husband. Joshua Rowe had learned Bengali and had preached in Bengali in Calcutta. But when they moved to Hindustan, when they moved further north, they now were in a Hindi-speaking area. Joshua never became fluent in Hindi. As a result, it was Charlotte that did the work with the local Hindi-speaking people. There were several schools already in existence. The buildings generally were constructed out of bamboo and grass. Charlotte began immediately recruiting girls for the schools because she strongly believed that girls should have the same opportunities for education as boys. It was a real struggle to teach because there were no teaching materials. So Charlotte immediately began to work on putting together a Hindi spelling book, and after that, a Hindi grammar, which were published by the Calcutta School Book Society and became teaching materials that she used. I would point out that this Hindi spelling book is part of the collection at the Angus. Charlotte would go from Diga out to the villages where she was starting schools to supervise them. She would go out to recruit teachers. Her method of transportation was by traveling in this kind of palanquin. This was the usual type of traveling accommodation by Europeans at that time in British India. Charlotte did not like to travel by palanquin. First of all, she felt it was demeaning to the men who were the bearers. And so as soon as she was able, she sold her palanquin in order to purchase a small cart and a pony to use in visiting her schools. Now, I've pointed out the difference between Charlotte, who was working in Hindi, and Joshua, who could only work in English. But because of the large number of people related to the East India Company in Patna and the English-speaking soldiers at Dinapur, Joshua Rowe had a wonderfully open opportunity to minister to English-speaking people. In short order, a congregation of dissenting believers came into existence on the cantonment grounds. They requested and were given permission to build a Baptist chapel behind the barracks. We don't have a picture of it, but it was described as being made out of bamboo and grass. So once again, very similar to the kind of structure that was used for the indigenous schools. Very quickly, as you might guess, the Baptist chapel was referred to as the grass tabernacle. On Sunday mornings, Joshua would go to the grass tabernacle and preach in English. On Sunday mornings, Charlotte would go to the Hindi-speaking Baptist church at Diga and oversee and lead the worship services there. The grass tabernacle eventually was torn down, a mud structure was put in its place, and then eventually a structure out of burnt bricks replaced it. That structure still stands, as is pictured here. It is now used by the Indian Army as a press. During this time that Joshua is ministering among English-speaking people and Charlotte among Hindi, Joshua and Charlotte became parents of twin girls. So now there's the 3 boys that Joshua had with his first wife, and now 2 little girls named Esther and Charlotte. So the family has expanded to 5. Everyone's very busy, working away, and suddenly the Rowes received a letter from the BMS London office reprimanding them for having allowed criticisms of the missionaries in Serampore to be printed in an American newspaper. Well, neither Charlotte nor Joshua could figure out what the London office was referring to. It didn't cite what the newspaper was. It didn't say what it was exactly that had been printed. Now, Charlotte, as I said, was the youngest of 11 children in the Attlee families. She was particularly close to one brother, Edwin Augustus Attlee, who had become a Quaker and was a physician in Philadelphia. So Charlotte had been in the custom of writing letters to her brother Edwin, and it was very important to her to be able to have someone with whom she could express her confidential thoughts and unburden her heart. And so she wrote right away to Edwin to say, we've received this letter from London. What's going on? Tell us what's happening. Edwin wrote back to explain that he had allowed some of Charlotte's letters to be read by other people. One of the persons with whom he had shared one of her letters was a religious visionary in Philadelphia named Theophilus Ransom Gates. Reverend Gates, as I say, was a religious visionary and published this newspaper called The Reformer. Gates was strongly opposed to any form of organization within Christianity. So he opposed organized Sunday schools. He opposed theological seminaries. He was against Bible societies, and he was certainly against missionary societies and the fundraising that took place to help support their work. When Theophilus Gates saw and read one of Charlotte's confidential letters, he observed that she was commenting on the controversy that had risen between the Serampore missionaries and the BMS. And that controversy, we won't go into the details now, but as you know, concerned property and concerned the question of who gets to make decisions in various things that relate to the work of the missionaries. I am quite certain that Charlotte and Joshua, being some 400 miles away from Calcutta, were hearing bits and pieces of that controversy. Clearly, it weighed heavily on Charlotte's heart and mind, and she expressed some of her misgivings in this letter, which were promptly excerpted and printed in the Reformer. Not only that, but about a month later, the editor of the Reformer named his source. You see here, he says, concealment of the name being no longer enjoined upon us, we now inform the public that the writer is Charlotte H. Rowe. Mrs. Rowe superintends a native female school at Diga, is zealously, and we believe sincerely, devoted to the cause of missions, and is the wife of one of the English Baptist missionaries. And then he cites that this came from a letter written to her brother, Dr. Edwin Augustus Attlee. So not only was an excerpt stripped out of one of her letters and quoted in this public newspaper, but she was identified as the source. You'll also notice that Reverend Gates did not identify Charlotte as a missionary. He identifies her as the wife of a missionary. Again, all part of this separate spheres ideology. Charlotte wrote back to her brother, don't you remember that I said that much of this correspondence is confidential? Her brother wrote back and explained to her, yes, I recall that you said that you didn't want anything published out of these unless you had given permission. But you must remember that I never formally agreed to that. And you certainly know that unless two parties formally agree, there is no contract. And I felt this was too important to keep from the public. Well, while this exchange of letters is going on, Charlotte and Joshua have another child. A little baby boy was born. Charlotte was so close to her brother Edwin Augustus Attlee that they named this baby boy after her brother, Edwin Attlee Rowe. By now, a final letter arrives from Edwin, clearly indicating, yes, he knew she had wanted this to be confidential. No, he was not willing to do that. She had asked him subsequently to burn her journal and all of her letters. He said flatly, I refuse to do that. The relationship between Edwin and Charlotte was irretrievably broken. Now, Charlotte was not in any position to defend herself in newspapers far away in the United States. But that did not mean that she lacked agency. When she became aware of her brother's role in making confidential correspondence a matter of public record, she changed the name of her child. Instead of being brought up to emulate her brother, his uncle Edwin in Philadelphia, he would be named Judson Ward Rowe, named after Adoniram Judson working in Burma, and the warm-hearted William Ward working there in Serampore, who had died of cholera just a month before the little boy was born. Several months later, tragedy again strikes. Charlotte's husband, Joshua Rowe, died, October of 1823. Soldiers from the cantonment carried his body to a cemetery on the cantonment grounds. They erected a memorial stone over his grave. I traveled there with a group in 2019 to try to find the grave. We were warned that the jungle had overtaken the cemetery, and you can see that truly it has. So as of today, the particular headstone, the gravesite, has not been located. But now Charlotte has been left the single parent of 6 children. She is the sole missionary managing the Diga mission station. She is the supervisor of 10 schools. She is the leader of the Hindi language Baptist church. She is the supervisor of 2 local indigenous Hindi-speaking evangelists, and she has the full weight of administration of the mission and communication with London, all of this on her shoulders. You know, of course, that Andrew Fuller was the first secretary of the BMS, but he had died in 1815. John Dyer was the secretary to whom Joshua had been writing, and with whom now Charlotte picks up the correspondence. Once again, the Angus Library and Archives serves the wonderful function of having preserved this correspondence. And so we get an inside view of problems, of concerns, of the actual operation of the mission. Charlotte knew that things were tough, but things became even tougher when she received a letter from London explaining that from here on, she would have to pay for any of the costs of repairing the property at Diga. Remember I said that she had been funding her own ministry ever since 1815? This additional expense meant that her efforts to self-fund her ministry were no longer viable. But Charlotte had a plan. She knew that if the society in London would appoint her as a missionary with a modest salary and would appoint 2 other missionary couples, that together they would have enough personnel to restart the English-speaking boarding school so they could generate funds to operate the mission in Diga out of that earned income, and would have enough personnel to not only stabilize, but also to continue to expand the mission. She made this proposal to the executive committee in London. But Charlotte also knew that she could not afford to remain in Diga and carry on this correspondence when it took 5 months for a letter to get from Diga to London. So she determined that she would have to go to London herself. By this time, she had established the 3 oldest of her stepsons in situations in Calcutta, either in employment or as being mentored by individual people. So she took her 3 children, the twin girls and little Judson Ward, and left Diga. They got on a budgerrow, one of those flat-bottomed barges that slowly makes its way up and down the Ganges. No steamboats had yet reached this part of the Ganges. So she makes her way down 400 miles on her way down to Calcutta. On the way, they came upon the scene of a woman preparing to throw herself onto the funeral pyre of her deceased husband. Charlotte immediately asked the rowers of the budgerrow to pull the boat over to shore, and she called out in Hindi to this woman and those gathered there, and began to urge the woman to not take her own life. She argued with the woman that the British administration had said that this act was illegal unless there was a permit by the Governor General, by the local magistrate. The boatmen on the barge were also shouting to the crowd and urging the woman and her children to come on board the barge, and said, "The missionaries will take care of you." By this time, the crowd was getting very boisterous, and it was clear that Charlotte needed to back off. So she gave orders for the budgerrow to push back. It continued its way down the Ganges, or down the Hooghly at this point, and she later learned that the woman had thrown herself on the funeral pyre and died with her husband. The long trip was made from Calcutta to London. Charlotte, upon arrival, immediately went to Fen Court, where the executive committee was holding its meetings, and she met with the leadership of the BMS. Now, as I said, Andrew Fuller, the first secretary of the BMS, had died in 1815, 11 years earlier. But his influence was clearly, strongly felt within the BMS and beyond. And one of those areas on which he had expressed himself was the question of women or females being appointed as missionaries. In a defense that he had written of the British Baptist work in India, Andrew Fuller wrote, are women to be reckoned as missionaries? If so, we have considerably more than 11 missionaries in Bengal. There were 11 men, but we have considerably more if we count the women. But he concludes a little later in his article that since wives do not preach, they ought not to be called missionaries. So Charlotte enters an environment which did not envision women as appointed missionaries. The Baptist Missionary, or the Baptist Magazine of 1824, gives an illustration of this. When talking about the Diga mission, remember Joshua Rowe died in 1823. 1824, the Baptist Magazine is talking about the Diga station and says it became vacant by the death of Mr. Rowe. And that's the way that the BMS referred to Diga for the following 3 years. 3 years that Charlotte is there doing the work, doing the ministry on her own, but in the views of the society, the station, the mission was vacant. In other words, Charlotte was facing the same kind of challenge to be recognized as a female missionary in England as she had faced earlier in the United States. We know about the depth of this commitment to the separate spheres ideology when in 1842, the BMS was about to celebrate the 50th anniversary. It printed the speech of one of the primary speakers, the Reverend William Brock, who at one point in his remarks addressed the women in the crowd. Ladies, it is not yours to be supreme. It is ours. It is yours to obey. But though it is ours to be supreme, yet it is a supremacy in which there is to be nothing capricious, nothing tyrannical. You are not to be our drudges today and our toys tomorrow. You are our companions. You are our helpmates. Well, helpmates, to be sure, but not helpmates in the sense of having an equal status or recognized equality of function. In the view of the officers of the BMS, Charlotte had not come to their office as a missionary. She had come to their office as the widow of a missionary. She presented her proposal that she be appointed, two other couples be appointed. She left the office still as the widow of a missionary. Now, Charlotte almost immediately settled in the community of Yeovil. We do not know at this point why she settled there, whether her husband had relatives there or whether she somehow had other connections through her own family. But she was at Yeovil for a period of time. We know that she stayed for 3 years in England before returning to the United States. It's quite possible that she used that time to settle her affairs in India. She had been urged by a number of friends in India to return and to restart a boarding school. But she said, look, I want to be there to minister. I don't want to be there simply to raise funds. So 3 years later, she brings her family, her 3 children. They go back to Philadelphia. She starts a boarding school at her house in Philadelphia. She begins to write articles for a local Baptist newspaper telling of her experiences and using the pen name Onesta. She moves from Philadelphia to a small Alabama town called Lounsboro, probably because of the health of the little boy. We say that because he has never heard of since. She is immediately plunged not only into the work at the Lounsboro Academy, but also into an environment of slavery. We know from her journal that she abhorred slavery. She moved back from Lounsboro to Pennsylvania, to a community called Strasburg, about 8 miles from her childhood home. She was recruited to restart the Strasburg Female Seminary. That building still stands in the community of Strasburg. She and one of the twins worked, she as the principal, her daughter Charlotte as one of the principals. Once again, however, dual tragedies hit her life. 1851, one of the twins, Esther Ann, died, and her body was taken to Lancaster and buried in the Episcopal Cemetery. The next year, the other twin, Charlotte, died, again was brought to Lancaster. Charlotte at this time was 72 years old. She moved back to the Philadelphia area, and on Christmas Day, 10 years later, 1863, she died. Her body was brought to Lancaster. A funeral was held at St. James Episcopal Church. She also was buried in the seminary, or the cemetery. All we have now are her picture, her journal, the wonderful trove of letters at the Angus, and her portrait. Charlotte was buried in the middle of the winter, in the middle of the American Civil War, in an unmarked grave. Thank you, friends.
Well, Reid, thank you so much. I'm sure that everybody would like to show their appreciation, to say thank you so much for such an incredibly interesting talk. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
That was so fascinating. Charlotte was obviously a woman who was ill-used and betrayed, really, but who was redoubtable. And I think she was a true survivor, really.